This week, a lot of our pastoral staff was in Kansas City for the week at a conference called M25, Missions 25. And it was really about evangelism and talking about reaching out and sharing our faith. And there's so many things. I hope that as you talk to pastors this week, they'll share some stories with you about what God spoke to them or what they heard or what they were challenged by. But one of my favorite sessions was by a man named John Maxwell. You may have heard of him before. If not, you should Google him. He's famous. Semi-famous. He's written like 92 books. The first time I heard him talk about leadership was in the 1990s at a giant church gathering, so he's been around for a while. And I got to be honest with you, I wasn't super excited about hearing about John Maxwell. Sometimes when you know about someone's stuff for 30 years, you're kind of dying for something fresh and different. But he surprised me with what he was talking about. He didn't give a lecture on leadership, but instead about evangelism. And I thought, well, that's rich coming from a guy who has big speaking venues and probably goes back to a green room and all this kind of stuff. But he actually had some really interesting things to say. He talked about how he positions his whole life in order to have the opportunity to tell people about Jesus. And some of the things that he said were very, very convicting to me. For example, he said, this is really simple, but he said, we see people saved through our ministry because we hang out with lost people. Now, that may seem pretty simple. It's hard to save saved people. But he said, how many times do churches just want to hang out with church people? It's safe and it's comfortable to be around the saved. And then he said, how many more Bible studies do we really need in our life before it takes? I thought that was a pretty funny quote. How many more Bible studies do we need before it finally takes? We need to go out and make people hungry for the gospel. But instead, he said, many Christians are making people angry instead of hungry. That was convicting to me. And this is the last thing he said that was convicting, and Pastor Austin talked about this, talking to the worship team this morning as well. He said, 53% of people will never step foot inside of your church just because of advertisements, location, driving by. 53% of people are wound to not go to church. We're past just a church existing or being built and people will come. 53% of people will not come to your church just because it's there. And he said, all my friends in the business community, if they heard a number like that, 53% of people will never use your product. They don't know about your product. They don't care about your product. He said they would be so driven to enter into that market of 53%. He said that their minds would be blown that 53% was an untapped market. And they would start meeting and strategizing and working to break into that market. But then he says, but here's the problem, guys. Business people like money more than church people care for souls. That was convicting to me. What do we really care about? What do we really care about? I was happy this week to get a message from someone in this church who told me that within the last month they invited an atheist friend to church. Now, think about that. That's pretty uncommon, right? Usually when someone's an atheist, you think, they're probably pretty solid in their beliefs. They invited an atheist friend to church, and they came. And they had a good experience. They did not become Christian because of some marvelous sermon that was preached from up here. I try. But still, taking the risk in the long road and making friends with people who don't know God and inviting them into your life and into your church is such an important step. And hearing back that people who are far from God are disinterested in God or tired of God or whatever their perspective may be, being willing to invite them into your life, into your church is such an important step. And it's so exciting that we have the kind of church where people can come here far from God and say, I felt accepted. I enjoyed myself. I learned something. I met nice people. This is all important steps to seeing people find God. And so thank you for being such a warm church and a helpful church when it comes to reaching out to others. Last week, we talked about Elijah. We've been talking about Elijah all month, but last week was the big, grand, epic story. One of the major stories, one of the wildest stories, one of the most miraculous stories of the Old Testament, where Elijah wins a decisive battle against the prophets of Baal, where he wets an altar over and over and over with water and calls fire down from heaven, and the altar becomes a consumed flame, and God makes himself known as more powerful than Baal. And so, this week, we're talking about the story right after that. And I think, I've told you from the very beginning that I think that this This story of Elijah can be super relatable to us folks. And I want to tell you that today is the day that's relatable more than any other. You might never have thought that you might be the one to call down fire from heaven and light down an altar. I know I've never thought I'd be that person. But let me tell you, I've been Elijah in today's text before. And I suspect that you have been as well. Because Elijah has just seen one of the greatest miracles ever seen, ever told, ever experienced. And in this text today, he is struggling. He is hurting. He's afraid. He's depressed. He's lonely. And my suspicion is that all of us have experienced one of those emotions before. Some of us may have experienced those emotions this week. Some of us may have experienced those emotions this morning. And I want to show you how God moves, not just on mountaintop experiences where fire comes down, but when we're lonely, when we're depressed, when we're brokenhearted, when we're afraid. The reason Elijah is afraid is because the queen wants to kill him. Jezebel is the queen who has brought Baal worship into Israel, and she has adorned the entire nation with her idolatry. And now Elijah has shown that Baal is a false god, and she is mad. So she is ready to chase him all around the country until he is slain. Setting the scene today is 1 Kings chapter 19, verses 1 to 2. This is what we learn about Jezebel and the place that she is at. Ahab, the king, told Jezebel that all that Elijah had done and how he had slain all of the prophets with the sword. Then Jezebel sent a messenger unto Elijah, saying, "So let the gods do to me, and more also, if I make not your life as the life of one of them by tomorrow about this time." She's saying, I'm going to kill him. He's killed all my prophets. I am going to kill him. And so Elijah goes on the run because he knows that the most powerful woman in the nation wants him dead. And so that is the context of where we find Elijah today in 1 Kings chapter 19. And so I'm going to invite you, if you would, to stand with me. Verses 3 through 18 is what we're going to read today in 1 Kings chapter 19. Elijah was afraid and ran for his life. When he came to Beersheba in Judah, he left his servant there, while he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness. He came to a broom brush and sat down under it and prayed that he might die. That's quite a prayer. "I have had enough, Lord," he said. "Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors." Then he lay down under a bush and fell asleep. All at once, an angel touched him and said, "Get up and eat." He looked around, and there by his head was some bread baked over hot coals and a jar of water. He ate and drank and then lay down again. The angel of the Lord came back a second time and touched him and said, "Get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you." So he got up and ate and drank. Strengthened by that food, he traveled 40 days and 40 nights until he reached Horeb, the mountain of God, where he went into a cave and spent the night. And the word of the Lord came to him. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He replied, "I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, put your prophets to death with sword, and I am the only one left. And now they are trying to kill me too." The Lord said, "Go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a gentle whisper. When Elijah heard it, he pulled his cloak over his face and went out and stood at the mouth of the cave. Then a voice said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He replied, "I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars and put your prophets to death with a sword, and I'm the only one left. And now they're trying to kill me too. It's like he's saying, didn't I tell you the first time why I'm here? The Lord said to him, go back the way you came. Go back to the desert of Damascus. When you get there, anoint Hazael, king over Aram. Also anoint Jehu, son of Nimshi, king over Israel. And anoint Elisha, son of Shaphat, from Abel Meholah, to succeed you as a prophet. Jehu will put to death any who escape the sword of Hazael, and Elisha will put to death any who escape the sword of Jehu. Yet I reserve 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed to Baal, and whose mouths have not kissed him. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. I think this is a powerful story, but it may take some breaking down together. I said I think you'll relate to Elijah in this story, but at the same time, I imagine you've never had an evil queen chasing you with a sword. I imagine that's not happened before. I hope that's not happened to you before. But at the same time, I think there's a lot we can get out of this story and a lot of sense that we can understand ourselves in this story. For example, Elijah begins by praying, and his prayer is basically, I want to die, and then he says, I've had enough, Lord. I've had enough, Lord. That is a whole prayer in itself right there. I think a lot of times we think when it's time to pray, if we want to be a good prayer, we got to just, 30 minutes, face on the floor, flowery words. I think this is a whole prayer right here. Looking at the God who created the universe and just simply saying, I have had enough. And so I have a question for you today, especially if you identify with that prayer. If you've experienced that sense, that emotion right there, I want to ask you, when you reach the bottom, when you are depressed, when you are lonely, when you are angry, when you have nothing left in the tank, what do you want God to do? I think a lot of times what we want is fire from heaven, an earthquake, a mighty, magnificent act of God. But I think it's kind of interesting what God does here before he speaks. There's this it's famous tweet from Twitter. I think it's called X now. Who knows if you look at this anymore, but this has always cracked me up what this person says. So I'm going to show this to you because I think it's instructive a little bit sometimes of what God does before God really acts. This is what it says. This is your gentle reminder that one time in the Bible, Elijah was like, God, I'm so mad I want to die. So God said, here's some food. Why don't you have a nap? So Elijah slept, ate, and decided things weren't so bad. Never underestimate the spiritual power of a nap and a snack. That's pretty good. That's pretty good reading right there. Sometimes, when we're really mad and we're really lonely and we're at the end of our rope and we have nothing left, sometimes the best thing we could do is take a nap and have a snack. I think there's power in that. And it's great that the angel of the Lord prepares it all for him. That's kind of an added bonus. You might have to walk to your refrigerator. But still, sometimes waiting to make big decisions about how you feel might change with just a little bit of a regulation of your blood sugar or your napping time. I think that's pretty good. But once Elijah is cared for, he has his snack, he takes his nap, it doesn't solve the problems, right? Elijah's feeling a little better. He can now articulate to God more than just, I want to die and I've had enough. He can be a little clearer about what his problems are. He can be a little clearer in prayer about what he needs from God. And so it's important for us to ask, once the blood sugar is regulated, once his brain is working a little better, what exactly does God do? And God speaks to him, and this is what God says. All right, Elijah, now that I've got your attention, now that you're a little calmed down, maybe now you're not so angry, what are you doing here? What is it about this location, this space? What is it about your attitude? What is it about what you have to say? What does it have to do with anything? Why are you even here, dude? You can't solve any problems here. Why are you here? It reminds me a little bit about something that my mom used to say to me that made me mad. Because, I want God to do something big at this moment. When I was a kid, I used to I used to chase people and get chased a lot. You remember that as a kid? And every time I would knock something over, my mom would grab me and look at me and say, why are you running in the house? Or why are you running in the church? Or why are you running in the store? And my answer, I thought, was pretty simple. It was, well, because they were chasing me. And my mom would say, well, if you don't run, they can't chase you. And that would make me so stinking mad. It doesn't solve the problem. They'll just catch me that way. This answer that God gives here reminds me a little bit of that. Elijah probably wanted to shake his fist at God. What do you mean, what am I doing here? Have you not been watching? Have you not seen what's going on? There is a mad, crazy woman with a sword who wants that to go right through my neck. She wants to hold my head up like a conquest. What do you mean, why am I doing here? I'm hiding from the crazy lady. And so God says, all right, I understand. You're afraid. You feel alone. Life has been difficult. It's been a hard few weeks. I get it. Stand outside and the glory of God, the power of God is going to come by. And you just wait for the word from God, okay? And so Elijah says, great, that sounds good. I hope there's a fire and an earthquake is probably what Elijah thought. I deserve that. And so Elijah walks outside of the cave. And then all sorts of incredible things begin to happen. The first thing is a powerful wind cuts through. And it cuts through so powerfully that things begin to shake and move, and an earthquake comes. And as the wind and the earthquake comes, Elijah's like, okay, where's that voice of God? Speak to me. And he hears nothing but destruction. And then a powerful fire moves past the edge of the cliff. And Elijah looks for God in the fire. And I think at this point we're thinking, yeah, this is how God is going to speak when I'm really angry, or when I'm really alone, when I'm really depressed. Give me some sort of a message from on high. Speak with power and might. I need it. I deserve it. And all of these natural phenomenons are happening, these incredible things that we associate with miracles, and yet God isn't present in any of it. And Elijah has got to just be like, you told me to come here. Why aren't you speaking? And all of these miraculous, incredible things. And then there's a quiet whisper outside. There's been destruction. There's been fire, there's been earthquake, and God has not been in any of that, but God is in a whisper. And so Elijah moves out to listen closer to that whisper. And he draws close and he attunes himself to the whisper, and the whisper of God says, Elijah, what are you doing here? And at that point, I'd probably lose my mind, because that's exactly what God said last time. What are you doing here? What do you mean, what am I doing here? I'm the only one left. All the other prophets are killed. I have been righteous. I have been zealous. I've done everything right, and look where that's gotten me. This close to death. I'm scared. I'm angry. I'm hurt. I'm frustrated. I need more than you questioning me. You ever pray that before? I've experienced that very sense in my own life as well. I want something miraculous. I want something big. I want Jezebel. I want Jezebel killed. I want her put out. I want to be able to walk freely. I want my enemies vanquished. I want it easy. I've been the one in the right. I've been good. I've done everything you've asked me to. Why is it that I'm not seeing the blessing I think I deserve? I've felt that many, many times in my life. And yet we find over and over and over that what God whispers instead is, why are you still here? Why aren't you on the move? Why don't you have something that you should be doing? Don't you have something you should be up to? I think it's important for us to wrestle with the kind of thing that God says when God whispers. Because when God whispers, we've got to be silent. We've got to let the world around us be silent. We've got to lean in to hear what God has to say. And what God has to say isn't always just I've got you. I'm going to take care of your problems. Sometimes what God says is, keep moving. Keep going. Take the next step. Go into the areas that are problematic. I will be there with you. I will go with you. I will help you. I will support you. I will make a way for you. But I can't make a way for you if you're just hiding from your problems in a cave. And more than anything, there's a subtext to this prayer that I think is important to us as well. And it's important to me. It's an important reminder. What's amazing is that God has just provided for Elijah the most incredible miracle that he could possibly imagine. Elijah has just stood in public in front of everyone who is anyone and called down fire from heaven, and God answered the first time. And now, the next day, he hears that Jezebel wants him killed, and Elijah can't find within himself the power to rely on the past miracle. He can only see the current problem. And how often do we do that? Can we remember when God has helped us in financial straits? How many times can we forget that God has helped us when we were jobless or friendless? How many times do we forget that God showed up at just the right time to provide when we couldn't provide for ourselves anymore? God has been miraculous in our past, but every time a new, seemingly insurmountable problem shows up, we can't rely on the power of God in the past to say God will show up again. Instead, we retreat, assuming that God doesn't see us because we're in the middle of conflict or struggle or brokenness or hurt. Elijah is one day removed at the start of this story. One day removed from the biggest miracle he has ever seen. And the next piece of tension comes, and he can't imagine that God is going to show up miraculously again. You begin to understand God's point of view in this a little bit when you contextualize it. What God might be saying, and what are you doing here, is, you trusted me yesterday, why don't you trust me today? You saw my miracle yesterday, why don't you believe I can provide another one today? You showed up in power, you came out in public, you called down fire from heaven, and I answered. Why do you need a cave to protect yourself today? And so, God gives him instructions to get moving, to get going. And sure enough, God has a plan for Elijah's life. He just simply needs to move. And so I want to give you just a few takeaways today. I got 4 takeaways from this story that I hope will help inspire you as you move on into your next in life. First of all, I want you to know that God sees you. Whatever it is you're wrestling with today, whatever heartache, whatever fear, whatever uncertainty, whatever you don't know, whether you're mad at God or mad at your spouse or mad at your kids, whether you're lonely, whether you're tired, whether you're sad, whatever burden that's within your life today, God sees you. Elijah is burdened and he is afraid. And God has been near to him in his past, but still he gets into a low, scared place. It's okay to get into low and scared places. And just because God hasn't done something today at your demand doesn't mean that God doesn't see you. God sees Elijah. And Elijah's salvation is in his future, not today. But God sees him. God knows him. God hasn't left him just because today is difficult. Just because God is quiet doesn't mean that God is not near. Second, I want you to see that God isn't going to do the work for you. This one could be really, really difficult. Because what we want God to do when we're praying in a cave of surrounded protection, when we're afraid of the entire world, is we want God to go out in front of us and fix all of our problems so that we can walk in comfort through what's next in our life. We want God to rain down fire on our enemies. We want God to create earthquakes to make our way easy and simple in front of us. But that is not what God does. God whispers quietly to Elijah, get up and get moving. Sitting here isn't going to do anything for anyone. And what his future is incredible. God has an incredible plan for Elijah. There's going to be a new king. He's going to have a new friend and mentor. He's going to have protection from his enemies. He's going to find 7,000 like-minded people. These are all the promises that Elijah is given by God. But he's not going to find any of those promises locked up in a cave afraid of the world. Elijah has to get out of the cave and walk back towards his problems to see that God is going to move in his world. God isn't going to do the work to smooth the pathway so that he has an easy life the rest of the way. But when Elijah leaves the cave and heads back to what God is calling him to do, he is going to find that God is raising up help and friends and a future. But he's not going to find this out until he gets out of the comfort of the cave. The third thing I want you to see in this text is this. God has a plan for your future. Just as there's a plan for Elijah, there's a plan for you as well. God has a future for you. God has a plan, and God will meet you in that future. I know. Often we want God to meet us now, do it for us now, so our future is easier, but that is never how it works. Elijah has a future. We're going to see next week that he will never meet his demise, that God rescues him from demise over and over and over. Elijah's future is robust. It's exciting. His memory will be enshrined forever among God's people. His future is remarkable. And God has a plan for your future as well. But it's on us to step out into it and see what God is going to do as we move along. And then finally, the last thing I want you to see is that you are not alone. God may be calling you to get moving, to get risky, to get going, to do something. But God is active in each and every step you take. You can't get moving and find that God has stayed in your past. When God calls you out, when God sends you, when God invites you into something, you never go into that future alone. And in that future, you'll find incredible blessings because you are not alone. God will go with you and provide for you and help you every single step of the way. You are not alone. You may feel alone. Elijah feels alone in that cave. You may even seem alone. Elijah seems alone in that cave. But God sees him and meets him in the cave and reminds him that there's a robust life for him on the other side of the cave. So it is for you as well. You may feel stuck today. You may feel broken. You may feel depressed. And all of that stuff is probably very legitimate. It's not about whether or not you've made up your problems. We have very real problems in this life. We can hurt deeply. We can be scarred immensely. We can be incredibly lonely. We can be remarkably brokenhearted. We can be reasonably scared. All of these things are real. And yet, God doesn't leave us alone in those places of brokenness. He says to us, take a step into my future and see what an incredible future I have for you. I have plans for you. I'll go with you. I will help you. I will flourish you. I will provide for you. I will make a way for you. But you can't just simply love your loneliness and your brokenheartedness and your struggle more than you're afraid of your next step. What is God calling you out of? What is God calling you to or toward? I hope you wrestle with this question today, especially as we sing this final song. Where are you stuck? Where is God moving you towards? And what's the miracle you're missing because you're so comfortable in your stuckness? You identify with your stuckness. You identify more with the hurt and the loneliness than you identify with what God might be doing in your life. As we sing this final song today, I invite you to wrestle with these questions. And I invite you to test God as well. God might be speaking to you today, telling you exactly what your next step is. And you might be ignoring that or avoiding that, and you may not want no part of that. But I'm telling you, the victory is in following God's voice. The future is robust, it's exciting, it's good. But we've got to say yes to God. And if there's something you need to say yes to God to, or something in your life you need to say no to, I invite you to wrestle with that at our altar today. They are open, they are available. If God is speaking to you in any way, shape, or form, today is a great day to go and hear from God. And God is faithful to whisper what's on his mind to you. So come and pray. Would you stand with me and sing as we close out our service today?